Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Atif Qarni, who is the former Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Atif, it is so nice to have you join us here tonight. It has been an interesting time. We're only in March, the beginning of March, and yet it seems like so much has happened since the election last year, since the inauguration of our new governor and his day one commitments, a lot of which are centered around education. So at the end of January, you actually wrote an op ed piece for the Washington Post called The New Lost Cause. And I think it captured a lot of people's attention. And I'd love for you to just walk our viewers through what your thought process was and why you were prompted to write that op ed.
Sure, Catherine. And it's great to be back on the Inside Scoop. Thanks for having me on. The reason I wrote that op-ed, first, wanted to give the governor and the new administration a chance to settle in, to see how they would transition from the campaign and the rhetoric that was being used, which I had significant issues with, and then actually what would happen. So unfortunately, the executive orders that the governor issued as soon as he came into office, including Executive Order 1, that had several items in it referencing critical race theory, banning that, which is, clearly not taught in our K-12 schools, but also the use of the terminology and inherently divisive concepts. And as I read through the executive order, I really was disappointed in the way it was crafted and the things that were referenced. And this is a problem because it really reminded me of the movements of the past. For example, in the 1950s, where there had been a backlash to progress. For example, when the Brown versus Board of Education happened, it happened because of a 16-year-old girl, Barbara Johns, who started that movement, and it led to this landmark case. Virginia is also a place where massive resistance happened, and public schools were shut down for over 5 years, impacting all children, and really had a negative impact on all children. So that's why I'm really, really concerned, and that's why I wrote the op-ed, because this is an overall attack on our public education system. It's an attack on intelligent thinking, creative thinking, really teaching the full and honest history, and really elevating the contribution of all Americans. So out of those frustrations, I felt that because I know so much about education in Virginia, having served in my prior role, that I had to speak up. So that's why I wrote that op-ed.
And I will mention you were the 19th Secretary of Education here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and wonderful people had preceded you, including Ann Holton, who was a judge, an attorney, the wife of our former governor, Tim Kaine. And so there was a thoughtful policy process in place. There was an evolution in the thinking of how best to support public education, how to take 132 school districts and give them the resources necessary so that there's a standard of education, a standard of excellence across the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so it was very methodical. I don't recall, and I have lived in Virginia all of my life, a K through 12 education in Southwest Virginia. And, this has been so abrupt. I think it's taken all of us by surprise that something that had evolved, and there had been a lot of expertise and thought that went into the creation of these policies over a long period of time. And then suddenly it's kind of like someone has just pulled the plug, and all of these things are being introduced like divisive concepts. Where does that come from? I don't know if you can explain it any better than it's been explained by people trying to tackle this issue. There was an op-ed on February 28th that was written by a teacher of history at Thomas Jefferson High School of Science and Technology, who went line by line through HB 787 saying, how are we supposed to know what is legal to teach that doesn't bump up against things that have been thrown at us?
Well, what teachers, and my advice to teachers would be, is follow the state standards and you develop the local curriculum based on that, and you can teach uh, write verbatim what the state standards say, and you can teach outside of that scope. Even with the governor's executive order, there's limitations where it doesn't make it illegal for teachers to, for example, use the word equity or talk about how different uh, racial and ethnic groups were impacted, whether it's through Jim Crow, slavery, or the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example, or when you're talking about immigrants coming over and their experiences. Uh, so that's all okay, and that's the thing, is that I think that's where this confusion is, that there is an executive overreach here, where the governor didn't need to issue an executive order. He could have just easily directed the state superintendent to say, well, can you look at our standards and analyze them and assess them? But I think it was done more of as a political stunt to kind of appease the folks who worked on the campaign, who were raising a lot of noise, who were going to school boards. And I call these school boards things in the last year like these mini insurrections of sorts. But the last point I'll make is that there are also certain things that this rescinding of things that the state superintendent has done as a result of the governor's executive order. Some of the things actually were mandated by statute that the General Assembly passed. For example, culturally responsive and culturally competent professional development that educators have to receive. That's actually a statute. That was a bill passed and signed by Governor Northam. So that's state law. So they technically have to, not technically, they legally have to follow that. So it can't be rescinded via executive order or by state superintendent. So what my advice would be to educators is to continue to, make sure that you teach an honest and full scope of history. Look at the revised standards, really focus on that. Your job should not be jeopardized. And I know it's really unfortunate that we have this snitch line and teachers are being reported on. I know it's easier for us to say when you're not, we're not that classroom teacher facing that. And I've been a classroom teacher, and I know there's a lot of stresses there. So I'd really empathize and feel the pain. But it's certainly nothing wrong with teaching a full and honest history.
And you bring up something really important. You were a classroom teacher for 10 years. And so one of the things that I thought was marvelous, and I've known you since 2013 when you first ran for the House of Delegates, and you were a teacher then. You formerly served in the Marines. You have a very interesting background. But a lot of people applauded the fact that Ralph Northam appointed somebody with classroom experience to head the Department of Education. You brought just a different perspective, a frontline, hands-on, real-world, been there perspective to what it takes to teach children in a public school setting. And I don't know, there's a lot of political theater and a lot of political drama, and that whole tip line was just so awful on so many levels. But what do you think, what do you expect is going to happen? We've got 4 years ahead of us, and already there's a 30-day interim report, and then I'm assuming there's going to be a 90-day plan, perhaps. What do you foresee rolling out? I mean, I'm asking you to look into a crystal ball, which isn't fair, but where do you see this path leading?
Yeah, I think I definitely don't have a crystal ball, but where I guess want to tell you, and speaking of history and no pun intended, tell you where we have been and where we could potentially go if we don't stand up to Governor Youngkin and the silliness. But Virginia is been a leading state in education and the quality of education. It serves both in K-12 and higher education for many years. And I'm really proud of our record the last 4 years, because it was really highlighted by multiple rankings that education was, at the top. It was the best in the nation, and it's an evolution that I can't, or Governor Northam can't take credit for. It's also prior administrations who had done a lot of good work, and we built on that good work. And to your earlier point, that a lot of thought was put into this. So we have to maintain that quality of education, and big part of that quality is really embracing our diversity. making sure that we're addressing all the inequities that exist in education, and we're being inclusive of all the different needs of our students in pre-K through 12 and in higher education. Governor Youngkin doesn't really understand that. He's focused on the wrong priorities. Uh, and that's what my fear is. And if I did have a crystal ball, and if he continues down that path, I do see that the quality getting compromised and ultimately impacting our children and the families we serve. So one only thing we really could do as the Virginians who are sensible is to stand up, and is to make sure that we try to uh, uh, mitigate that by resisting as much as possible to this silliness, so we can right the course. And I hope and pray that the governor comes to his senses today, like right away. I don't know if he's going to over the next 4 years, but I certainly hope that he does.
Well, I do as well. I don't currently have children in the public school system. I did many years ago, and I'm grateful for the fact that they're not in school anymore. They're grown up, which is great. Um, but I'm not a constitutional scholar, Atif, at all. But it seems to me that the Virginia Constitution was written to give local control of schools to school boards, elected school boards. And there's 132, I believe, school districts in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's a very big state. I mean, Southwest Virginia, South Side, Central Virginia, Northern Virginia, all very different. And part of having this written into the Constitution is the fact that local school boards need to meet the needs of their local communities, but in partnership with a state Department of Education that kind of sets some basic standards, right? So it's a cooperative relationship theoretically between the Department of Education supporting the local school districts in giving guidance. And unfortunately, I think one of the lightning rod issues was around the policy regarding transgender students. And you know, President Biden in his State of the Union address actually called out and recognized trans students and their families and the divisiveness where these children are being attacked in our public schools systems. And I know that is a policy that you worked on and gave a lot of thought to, and it was not a sudden thing either.
No, it wasn't. And there are two things I want to address, and I'll start with the transgendered students policy. As a teacher, and as having taught students who are uh, part of the LGBTQ plus family community in general, I have students who were in the process of transitioning. I mean, I saw the challenges students face firsthand and talk to them, uh, and not only those experiences and those anecdotes, being a classroom teacher, traveling the state, sitting down with students, sitting down with their peers, because there's a lot of peers and families who are concerned about this as well. Uh, the it, it's a significant concern, and research shows that suicide ideation is exponentially higher for LGBTQ plus students, specifically trans students, compared to their peers, and that is because of the challenges they might face with acceptance by their family and friends and overall community, the bullying students might face. These are children who face a significant amount of bullying. So based on those testimonials, and based on sound research, and based on a lot of review of good model practices, we came up with a very sound policy, which I think we could have done even more, but a very sound policy to create more inclusive practices so students can go to the restroom or go to a gym and use that facility in a safe manner. And those accommodations could be made. And to the credit of some of the schools, they were already doing this work. But again, I think this is one example where this movement, this big umbrella of hatefulness and vitriolic behavior, that CRT or attacking transgender students or attacking anything that's classified as other or different, it's really, really unfortunate. The governor Youngkin took a hold of it and became part of this movement in the campaign, and unfortunately transitioned right into his administration. It's really, really unfortunate. We have to protect all of our children. So that, and then the second point I want to make about the local school board controls, you're absolutely right. During the COVID pandemic, which was very challenging, we had to think through what do we do with schools, what do we do with masks, what do we do with dissemination of PPE and funds and so forth. Yes, there were some school boards who were not happy that maybe we were a little too restrictive. Some were not happy maybe we were too loose, but we worked with them, and we still honored the local school board control. We consulted a lot with them. At no point there were lawsuits filed that the Governor Northam lost, right? They were frivolous things, but Governor Youngkin's already been sued and lost cases for some of his silliness, and it's only been a month. That just shows that they're not looking at their laws, they're not looking at the Constitution, one, so there's some significant legal issues, and two, they're really not being empathetic and really understanding what local communities' needs are. And he keeps saying, well, we have to listen to parents, but which parents are you talking about, right? Are you talking about all the parents who live in urban settings and rural settings, or suburban settings? Are you listening to Black and brown parents? Are you listening to parents who have students with special needs? Are you listening to parents that might have an LGBTQ plus child? Or are you just listening to a very small group of parents who are just focused on in this echo chamber of Fox News, for example? And that's where the thing is, like, who are you listening to? So it's really hypocritical and a double standard, is that you want to impose the will on millions of people and tens of thousands of families and parents, and then at the same time you want to say, well, I'm listening to parents. Like, it doesn't really make any sense to me.
No, because parents are not monolithic.
They're not.
No group of people anywhere is monolithic. And when you say listen to parents, I think it definitely is listening to parents who are Youngkin voters or are conservative or share certain specific values. But that is not all parents. And as someone pointed out to me, is parents have always participated. Parents have always been welcome in the schools. Parents have always been welcomed in classrooms and PTA meetings, to speak with teachers and librarians, and to show up at their school board meeting long before people started talking about CRT. And so parents have never been excluded from the classroom. And to me, this is such a false narrative. And it's a false narrative designed to inflame a certain specific group of parents.
Right. It is. And teachers, many teachers are parents. School board members are parents. The reason people run for school board is because they have their children, they care about education. Superintendents and the central office people, like, they're parents too. And that's the thing, is that this driving a wedge between different groups is really, really unfortunate. And in the pandemic, when we were dealing with, in the Governor Northam, we, of course, I'm a Democrat, he's a Democrat, but it wasn't like we were only listening to just one set of things. We were, everybody was coming to us, and we came to a happy medium and understanding, looking at the data and science. And it wasn't like we were just listening to one group and setting our agenda and trying to appease a voting base. We were looking at the science, and we're listening to all perspectives, giving folks flexibility, being nimble, and trying to meet the communities where they are. And that's what a thoughtful leadership looks like. So again, I hope that he comes to his senses, but I'm not too optimistic where the Youngkin administration is heading, but I'm really hoping that they come to their senses.
And so all the efforts that were made toward diversity, equity, and inclusion, and let's just be honest here, it's like there was an evolving sense that we were not necessarily meeting the needs of diverse children in our school community. But then George Floyd was murdered, and there were, the summer of riots, and suddenly, people were marching in the streets in towns big and small in Virginia and across the United States, and actually in cities around the world, to recognize that racism is real and it's oppressive, and that there isn't cultural competency in the fact that many people who decide on policy are white people. And so the world kind of as a group, decided that we all needed to do our homework. All of us needed to invest in the workplace, in our governments, in our communities, in understanding what it means to create an environment that is diverse, that has equity built into it, and that is inclusive of more people, more people's perspective. And so I mean, what I have heard is that that is being stripped away. That equity is, no longer going to be a word that's used in the Youngkin administration. Equity is not a thing that the Department of Education is interested in pursuing anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really unfortunate. One thing that I do want to clarify is that folks have attacked Governor Northam or the rest of the administration, saying that you all only started talking about diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives when things like the George Floyd situation was happening, or because we had the blackface scandal. That's actually not accurate. And I've reminded folks is that if you go and look at the documentation, since very day one, the Northam administration said we were going to do everything through a lens of equity. And the Ed Equity initiative that's being stripped away, that started right away as soon as I walked into the door, because my predecessor, Ann Holton, who's amazing, had done a lot of work in addressing a lot of these inequity issues. And then when the new administration came in, we picked up the baton and we reframed some of the things, gave a little bit more structure based on the research that they had conducted. So it was a nice handoff. But our equity initiative started from day one. And then to answer your question, yes, absolutely. It was really unfortunate that this is being stripped away, because what our research has showed us, years of research, is that Black children, both girls and boys, are 3 times likely to get a discipline referral, a suspension, or an expulsion for the same infraction that their peers are. And that rate is a little bit higher for Latinx students compared to white and Asian students as well. So the data is really clear. This is years worth of data. And this is not just an issue that exists in rural parts where the school divisions might be predominantly white. This issue exists in predominantly Black and brown school divisions. So even Black educators have significant issues and biases built in when they're writing discipline referrals. And these are tough conversations to have, but that's what our research showed us. So we had to do something about it. Virginia Tech did a whole study on this. It looked at years worth of data, which was sanctioned by the General Assembly, by the way, prior to the Northam administration coming into place. So that's one aspect. Then another aspect is that when we analyze our history curriculum, does not really get into the depth of the contributions of so many Americans. So that's a huge deal. Like when I used to teach history in my classroom, I taught a lot of students who were Black and brown children. And I'm like, how are you not learning about the contributions of Cesar Chavez, for example, or the different struggles that even Asian Americans face through the Chinese Exclusion Act, or a variety of other things? We just glance over them. So there's just so many examples that I can give you that we really had to do. And this is something that families across Virginia wanted to see change. They demanded it, that please look at our history curriculum. And then the one last thing I'll mention is that just creating a more culture of care, because many children face different types of abuse at home. They have adverse childhood experiences, and very few professionals in our school settings, being like school counselors, who have training in trauma-informed practices. Not every educator does. We wanted to also make our schools more trauma-informed, focus more on social and emotional health, because if we address those needs, then it's going to ultimately help more students have a better experience. They will love more education more. It will increase learning. It would increase the rate of children going into higher education. So all of the things, we have to take a holistic approach. And this is what we did. This is what Ed Equity was about, is looking at all of the different ways where we can better help students of all different perspectives. It wasn't just about race. And that's the thing, is I think this is where this limited thinking and narrow thinking, this a new administration has, they just really don't get it. And they think that equity is just about race. And even if it was just about race, that's not a big deal, because we know that there are significant issues around race, but it's more than that. And that limited thinking and this hyper focus on critical race theory, and the rescinding of the 9 things that the state superintendent has rescinded or is attempting to rescind, is going to do a lot of damage.
Well, as I said, 12 years of K through 12 in the 1970s. And so I can tell you, women were certainly not included in history. And there's a student, a young woman who recently really raised this up and created an initiative on her own, working with, curriculum professionals here in Fairfax County to say, why are we not teaching about the contributions of women to American history? So you're right. It is not just an issue of race. And when you think about indigenous people, the list of who has been left out of history is long. And there's an old axiom that says, he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. And so much of this, to me, is a fight for control of the narrative. And your op-ed was titled, the new lost cause, because the lost cause really was about rewriting the history of the Civil War, rewriting the Confederacy, and making traitors and treasonous people trying to destroy the United States heroes and building monuments to them. And I look at that and I think this is terrible. And as Virginians, we should care more about the fact that we need to teach all of our history. We are an extraordinary Commonwealth. My family has been here since before Thomas Jefferson was born. And I'm very proud to be a Virginian, but I think Virginians deserve and students deserve to understand that it's very complicated. And we've had wonderful people who have done amazing things, who also did things that were terrible, because life is complicated and our history is complicated. But to have children sit in classrooms and get a whitewashed version of what our history was in the name of patriotism, freedom, liberty, anymore, those words trigger me. I hear somebody say liberty, patriot. I'm like, holy cow, look around carefully, because those words don't even mean what they used to. We're going to go to a quick break. Join me after the break, because I am talking with Atif Qarni, who is the former Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
STEM is the discipline of hard numbers, precise, no margin for error.
Dare to forget that. Dare to have fun with it. Get weird with it. Dare to get messy, or just mess it up. Dare to program something internet-breaking, record-breaking. Dare to blow their minds. Dare to try. Dare to fail. Dare to keep daring. Dare to learn the difference between organic, sedimentary, and non-foliated metamorphic rock. Get outside, find those rocks. Dare to be homeroom famous, a high school fable. Dare to send those old STEM theories flying past the neighbor's house into outer space. And for the love of STEM, dare bigger. Dare to code, dare to invent, dare to explore, dare to STEM. Check out She Can STEM to get started.
Freedom. It's at the core of who we are. The freedom to live without fear, to jog where we please, to wear a hoodie. The freedom to breathe. Before we celebrate the freedom most Americans have, we must fight for the freedom all Americans deserve. Because all lives can't matter until Black lives matter.
What are you looking for?
Caitlin, be serious. Now take the oath. Come on. I'm totally taking this seriously. Okay, I'm ready. You may begin. I pledge that I will never meet in person with anyone I first met online without checking with my parent or guardian. And furthermore, if my parent or guardian agrees to the meeting, it will be in a public place and my parent or guardian must come along. Do you pinky swear? I do.
When you teach your kids about internet safety, they'll pass it on. For more information, go to cableclicksmart.org.
Maria, so how's work?
It was fourth period biology. Our students just weren't getting how easily viruses spread. So Miss Bell and I had them role play a zombie virus outbreak. By the time they had all learned the lesson, all the living were dead. Hey, how's your job going?
That big sales meeting I planned? Next year, I might get to go.
Cool.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're talking with Atif Qarni. He is the former Secretary of Education here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I am honored that Atif has taken time to talk with us about what is really an upheaval right now in our education system here in Virginia. You know, I feel like every day there is something new. Every day the headline brings us something fresh. One of the things that I would like to talk about, is governor schools. When we talk about equity, I think this is really important. And the Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology here in Fairfax County has had its own set of issues regarding changes to its admission policy. But I was also fascinated by an investigative journalism piece done by the Richmond Times-Dispatch on the Maggie Walker Governor's School, which is in Jackson Ward in Richmond. And it really did shine a light on how the best of intentions did not result in what was intended, especially with that particular governor's school. So can you talk a little bit about what you have looked at in your tenure in the Virginia Department of Education about the best way to apply equity to our governor's schools?
Sure. Thank you so much, Catherine. So this is an intersection of advanced academic or specialty programs and gifted education. So gifted education during the massive resistance era was utilized to really segregate, at post-massive resistance. And how does this intersect with governor schools? So I want to give a bit of a history to really fully understand the broader context. So the governor schools started in Virginia in the 1980s. And there's 16 of them. There's only about 16. They serve maybe around 10,000 students across the state. The two largest ones, the largest one is Thomas Jefferson High School of Science and Technology, located in Fairfax region. It serves the Northern Virginia region. And then you obviously have Maggie Walker, which is the second largest, about 800 students. TJ is about 1,800 students. Maggie Walker is about 800 students. And Maggie Walker serves the greater Richmond area. And the governor schools have their different themes. So when they were founded, folks came to an agreement that they will have a theme. So sometimes it's STEM related. Sometimes Maggie Walker, for example, is government relations related. Appomattox, for example, is arts related. So generally, what I noticed a trend, as it was pointed out to me, is that the governor school directors reached out. They said, we want to get an increase in state funding that governor schools receive directly. So governor schools, just like any other public school, depending on the amount of students they have, they get funding from the state. But on top of that, governor schools also get additional funding, which allows governor schools to have smaller class sizes. It allows them to pay teachers more so they can recruit maybe teachers who have doctorates, for example, or it allows for them to pay for lab equipment. For example, at TJ, if you are using lab equipment, it might be more advanced compared to other schools. So they definitely are much more well-resourced compared to an average high school. And that's the thing, is that where families, if they know that this school is more well-resourced, is higher of quality, that I want to send my child there. So initially, when governor school generally was started, they were like, well, we have certain parameters where we're going to really target gifted students. Or there was also conversations that we might look at advanced academics, and that really got conflated. And over the years, the system really forgot the real values of why governor schools were really started. And that's what we found that was happening at TJ and Maggie Walker specifically, is that there was a usage of a standardized test, which was an achievement test, not an aptitude test. So difference between an achievement and aptitude test is that an achievement test is where you can really learn the content and do well on the achievement test. But an aptitude test is where it really shows the future potential of a child. So that's the question that I rose, is that what is the intention of governor schools? Is it truly for gifted children, or is it for children who are just really well prepared because they're really well resourced? Asking and looking at the history, folks were like, let's focus on truly gifted children who also have an interest in these areas, whether it's government relations and STEM. That is where all these inequities come up, is that families who might be really well resourced, they can really prepare their children to do well on a standardized test. And if that's the only measure that's being utilized to get into the governor schools, it's a problem. So that's why we need to take a holistic approach and look at different measures and take into account if a student might not have the resources, at least, maybe, provide them the resources to really level the playing field. Things also that were being used is like admission fees. I just didn't understand why governor schools who receive a lot of funding from the state were charging for application fees. It didn't make any sense. So that's the thing, is that these two schools, for example, are probably the most severe example of modern day school segregation in Virginia. But the overall problem is our really fragmented system that we have with gifted education. And this is not just a state issue. At the national level, the federal government has really never given any kind of guidance or mandates or any directives around gifted education. There's a lot for special education, for example, or there's a lot for English language learners, but there really isn't anything for gifted education. So when it comes to gifted education, it's kind of a wild, wild west in the education system, and that it's a significant problem. And this is where we are finding that's leading to inequities, that's leading to segregated systems, and that's what was happening with our governor schools. So that's what our research showed us. And I said, okay, if governor school directors, if you want more funding to your state allocation, we will do that, but you really have to make sure that you're increasing your outreach and talking about your program to all of the middle schools you serve, one, and then two, you're really looking at your admissions policy and making sure they're taking a holistic approach to take into account all of the different perspectives to make sure that we capture all of the gifted students and open those opportunities for them who are interested in coming. So that obviously created a lot of blowback. Backlash because
it did.
Yeah, so it did. And it is one thing I wanted to emphasize is the biggest problem is people wanted to make it about a race issue. It was more of an economic status issue, because if you look at the free and reduced population of these schools, for example, at TJ, it was only 1% of the students who were on free and reduced lunch in the previous 5 classes that were admitted, as opposed to this in the incoming freshman class after the new policy was put into place. 25% of the students were on free and reduced lunch. Same thing happened at Maggie Walker, is that folks wanted to make it about race, but it's really an economic status issue.
It is. It's about resources. And we talk about racism a lot more than we talk about classism in this country, but I mean, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but it is about classism and who has resources and access, who has access to gifted programs in elementary school. What children, we have 3 months during the summer based on this ridiculous agricultural school system schedule, which no longer applies because we are not an agrarian society. But in those summer months, there are students who sit at home while their parents work. And there are other students who go to summer camps and enrichment programs and get tutoring and private lessons. And that creates this incredible disparity when you talk about using tests for, allocating resources to students. And I love, that your distinction between aptitude and achievement, because there's kids who deserve an opportunity because they have an aptitude and are not resourced. But speaking of resources, I'm going to pivot us just a little bit to the discussion about charter schools. Historically, Virginia has not had a lot of charter schools. I personally have been advocating for community schools, which is a model of public school, for a long time. Me and Sam Rasool, man, we're like, community schools, that's the model we want. But now all of a sudden, Glenn Youngkin is talking about charter schools, and I just outsourcing education, outsourcing functions that should be government functions always makes me pause, because I don't think that the answer is necessarily privatization of services. And while charter schools may not be inherently good or bad, I'm sure they're not, but how they're used can be. And you look at New Orleans and the charter schools and what they've done to education in New Orleans, and I think we can say that there's real world examples of how this idea can go wrong.
I think there's three things there that you raise. One, about resources, and even in the the current budget, there is a significant cut. What Governor Northam proposed as he was going out is being heavily slashed currently, and I don't know what Governor Youngkin will do with the proposal, especially what the House Republicans have done and slash in our public education system. So that's a significant issue where we know research shows is that if you take a holistic approach and you talk about the community schools model, where it has worked, it is pricey. It does cost a lot of resources, but the return on investment is really huge, because if you can make sure and create a more seamless opportunity for students to finish and graduate and then go to higher education and graduate, then they're going to be in the higher income bracket, and they're going to pay higher taxes, and it's going to be a significant return on investment. Research data is clear about that. So that's one point. The second point that you raise is that when with the charter schools and the privatization, it's a big accountability issue, where the reason we have these government functions is that it creates a level of accountability, because we know when for-profits operate, whether they're in K-12 or higher ed, they're not meeting the needs of everyone. For example, we have 13% of our children in Virginia who attend our public schools have an IEP, it's an individual education plan for students who might have special needs. We have many, every child has different needs. So the accountability really goes by the wayside. So that's a significant concern where we want to keep that in mind. And privatization just hasn't worked. We should look at the research, we should look at the data. If it was a good model and if it was working, people will be open to it, but it hasn't not worked. And we have great models in our public education system that have produced results if done well, if they're integrated, and if they're done well. And then the last component is to specifically about gifted education and the intersection of class. Folks are not, no racial group is monolithic, and one of the things that I found in our gifted education system, which is fragmented, is that there is a lot of pressure being put on teachers and school counselors who are reviewing and who can get into, and because there's not a robust amount of guidance, parents who are really well resourced, they will utilize external sources and say, well, my child is gifted, and there are multiple intelligences. So I'm not saying that not all children are not gifted, but there is a manipulation of the system, and the system is being gamed by well-resourced families. So it's a significant concern. And when you raise issues like this, of course, there's going to be blowback, like it was in the TJ situation, because the questions I asked is that, well, how can we level the playing field for all children so the system's not being gamed by well-resourced families, and the well-resourced families who were gaming the system, I mean, they were naturally upset. So that's the question that overall, those three things that this new administration really has to ask is that, who are you really serving? Are you really serving the elites, or are you serving everyone else? So that's a big question for them.
It is. And we talked about the fact that Virginia geographically is a very, very large, very diverse place. And there's a lot of talk about rural schools and in schools in Southwest Virginia, where you have declining populations. And so you have consolidated high schools that serve large geographic areas. It's just a different ball game. And even the school construction, the average age of schools, I believe, is about 50 years old. And Fox Elementary burned down in Richmond, burned down. It's 111 years old. We just seems to me that despite the fact that we spend a lot of money on education, we should be asking ourselves, are we spending it appropriately? And does this budget that's right now being considered in the General Assembly reflect our values? Because budgets are nothing more than funding what you have said is your priority.
The current budget, if it goes the way it is definitely grossly inadequate. And even during the Northern administration, where we saw huge surpluses and we had federal stimulus coming in, things were falling short because we were so behind. So 60% of school buildings, there's about 1,900 school buildings across Virginia, were built 50 or older than 50 years, right? So after like 40 or 50 years, the bones of the building, the infrastructure gets impacted. There's a lot of work to be done. We have schools that are over 100 years old. My younger son actually went to Fox Elementary when we moved to Richmond. So I saw the leaking ceilings and issues, and I've been to, the 10 oldest schools in Virginia just to see what they're like, and there are significant concerns. I've been to a lot of schools, and that infrastructure money was essentially necessary. We were significantly behind. But in addition to that, you talk about rural areas and Southwest. That's why we made a lot of investments in broadband, because there's a significant digital divide. There's a lot of food deserts. So again, taking that holistic approach, and one administration has to build on top of the other. And that's what the Northam administration was doing, is building on the past work to say, well, we have to address broadband, we have to address food deserts, childcare deserts, school construction. We tried to monopolize. One silver lining with the pandemic was that it allowed for an opportunity for people to step back and say, hey, these are significant problems with our schools. So it provided a flashlight, and we took advantage of that situation to increase the state funding and also use our federal funding dollars to address that. But this governor is not talking about any of that. If you look at not only the budget, but just the speeches, it's just about critical race theory that, and critical race theory this, and anti-equity, and equity is a bad thing. I mean, they're really not talking about the things that are really needed. School infrastructure is not being mentioned. School nutrition is not being talked about. Mental health is not being talked about. So that's the thing, is that one thing we can all do collectively is to remind them what really should be valued.
And I get that same feeling, and we haven't even touched on book banning and the fact that, that this has spread like wildfire across the entire United States. The Anti-Defamation League, the ACLU, the Librarian Associations, there are so many organizations going, we have not encountered something like this in such a long time. And again, when we started out the show, we were talking about, which parents are we talking about? A small minority of very vocal parents who have an agenda, that think that their agenda is one that's going to be embraced widely. And the book banning, this is its own theater. And it really, to me, seems like a lot of this is just theater. And when I see the governor parodied on Saturday Night Live, I'm wondering to myself, is he just auditioning for the White House? Because he seems to be trying to out Ron DeSantis. And is all of this in Virginia really just some 4-year audition for something else? And all of this drama in theater is just a way of like pushing that agenda? I have to ask myself that. I do ask myself that.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's Abbott, Youngkin, or DeSantis, and whether they're auditioning, and even if they are, that's their business. What our business is, what I'm worried about is this auditioning is costing and doing a lot of damage to our future generation, because, and the history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but there's similar patterns. Whenever there's an attack on information and intelligence and learning, book banning, for example, it's a big problem. And there's malintent behind it. Why do we want to ban books? Why do certain groups want to ban books? Because we don't want our children to learn the full and honest history and the complexities. In our school systems, our school divisions and schools, for the most part, are very, very thoughtful. about what material is used, whether it's age appropriate, and what kind of conversations they're having with children. So it's really unfortunate that uh, these things are happening, but I think it's you could take Governor Youngkin out of the equation, but I think this movement to ban books is a bigger problem than just him. It's a national problem, and I think we need to stand up to it and really resist, because it's happening in higher education as well. And what my biggest fear, Catherine, is that this attack on education is going to drive people who are dedicated to the profession of education out of the profession, because I'm hearing from both folks in higher ed and in K-12 that they're going to retire early, or they will just leave the profession outright. And that's really going to be detrimental. And this is how big, powerful nations fall. This is what my fear is. As a true patriot and somebody who loves our nation, I mean, we have a lot of bad actors, like we're seeing with the whole situation with Russia and Ukraine, that the world needs us. It needs our leadership. And this thing that's happening internally, and it's really eroding America, it's a big problem. It's a much bigger problem than just one person.
No, I agree with you, and I don't know how to turn it back either. But also just speaking about education as if anybody can be a teacher, or talking about education as if it can be privatized to businesses and they know how to run schools, because our teachers don't get enough respect. They don't get enough money. They don't get enough of anything. And now you're right. They're being driven from the profession. And it's almost as if we're being fed this line that it doesn't matter because we'll just find people who can walk into a classroom and be teachers. But teachers are trained. There's curriculum that is a lot of time and money is spent developing curriculum and pedagogy, figuring out the best ways to teach every kind of student that is represented in Virginia classrooms. And that can't just be done by anybody. People can't just walk in off the street and be a teacher. And yet, I sort of feel like that's its own false narrative. And people are buying into that. And I think our teachers don't get the respect, and they're not getting paid as professionals, even though we expect them to have master's degrees, or, oh, you were talking about governor schools, they should have a PhD. Do we know what that costs? And what are you paying the people who invested their own money into getting that education to teach our children? The model itself makes very little sense.
Yeah, no, we definitely need to pay our educators more and staff, right? So as teachers, as counselors, as administrators, other staff, custodial staff, people have stepped up, and we've seen that in the pandemic, right? In the pandemic, there was a lot of attack on schools that they're shutting down. First of all, they never closed. They went virtual. Education still continued, but what people, benefited from, and what folks don't realize, is that in Virginia, for example, there's a lot of families that rely on school nutrition. Children rely on meals. So while schools were virtual, every single day, Virginia schools were providing 250,000 meals to children and their families every single day. And USDA actually has ranked Virginia as the top place for school nutrition. That's how well our teachers, our school nutrition workers, our custodial staff, our bus drivers who volunteered their time in the midst of a pandemic before there was a vaccine, making sure that the families were getting these school meals. That's just one example of people stepped up. Nurses really stepped up. They volunteered their time to the Virginia Medical Reserve Corps. They went and helped out with COVID testing or vaccination when it got rolled out. So many people stepped up. Teachers volunteered their time. So this is really unfortunate. We don't do this with any other profession. Well, maybe we do, but nowadays we're attacked even healthcare. But we're not going and telling doctors, and there's not executive orders being issued that this medicine that you're prescribing might be a divisive, or procedure you're doing might be divisive. There's no executive orders. There's no executive orders being issued for police officers saying, well, whatever you're doing, this interrogation or this traffic stop you're doing is divisive. So we're not doing that with other professions, but with education, I feel like it's just open season on public education, and it's a significant problem.
It is. And I want to give a shout out to bus drivers too, because we've lost a lot of bus drivers because of COVID and the age of our bus drivers. So many of them were retired and many of them had driven buses for decades. They were so devoted. Every person in a school system that touches a child has such an impact on that child. Their safety, feeling safe, feeling comforted, knowing that there's an adult who's there to take care of them, trusting those adults to take care of them. Every single person in our school system matters, and we don't often treat them that way. And I would also say, back during the recession, we talk about 2008, 2009, when cuts were made and there were staffing caps put on schools. You were talking about it's not just teachers, it's all the other staff in the school too. And the fact that we've never come back from some of those cuts to this day.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. And but I do remain optimistic that we can try to resist as much as possible, and then eventually in 4 years turn the tide and get more sensible leadership back in Virginia and right the ship. We just have to stay vigilant and continuing to stay informed and fight back of any kind of bad policy decisions that might be pushed in the Youngkin agenda.
And I think that's really important, that all of us have a voice and all of us have a vote, by the way. And, I don't know whether our House of Delegates is going to be up this year or next year, but the fact of the matter is you have to get involved. You have to vote your values. You do, because the people that you vote for are the people who make the kinds of policies that impact the quality of life for all of us in our communities, including in our schools. And we spend a tremendous amount of money funding our school system in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Thank you so much, Atif, for being here. I really appreciate you taking time to share your thoughts with us. I think all of us are very concerned. I want to be optimistic. I will continue to be a voice and to be vocal, and I know you will too. That when you see something, you will say something. Yes, that's an excellent policy. All of you, when you see something, say something, and also pledge to be part of the solution. It's not just enough to be a critic. We can't just go around constantly criticizing unless we have something to offer. And so be thoughtful and be kind, and be thoughtful in looking at what needs to be done in order to sustain, support, and create a world-class system of education in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I will remind you too that past episodes of Inside Scoop can be found on YouTube on the Inside Scoop channel. I have interviewed Atif before, a long time ago, but those things exist in history out there. Thank you so much, Atif. I appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you.
And for those of you at home, Inside Scoop is every Monday night at 8 p.m. here on Channel 10, Fairfax Public Access.